Dr. Monique Carter let out a tired sigh as she drove down the nearly empty highway. It had been another long shift at the hospital, 14 straight hours of surgeries, patient emergencies, and endless decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Though exhausted, she kept her hand steady on the wheel, her mind still replaying the events of the day. A young man had been rushed into the ER after a terrible car accident. His chances had been slim, but she had worked tirelessly, her skilled hands doing what they were trained to do. Against the odds, she had saved his life. Moments like those reminded her why she had chosen this path. It was late, past midnight, when she finally started her drive home. The city streets had quieted, and only a few cars shared the road with her. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the pavement, and the hum of her car's engine was the only sound in the stillness of the night. She was looking forward to getting home, taking a hot shower, and finally resting. But just as she was beginning to relax, something in her rearview mirror caught her attention. Flashing red and blue lights. Her heart sank. She blinked, hoping she was mistaken. But the lights remained. A police car was right behind her, siren off but lights signaling her to pull over. Monique took a slow breath, keeping her emotions in check. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't broken any traffic laws. So why were they stopping her? She signaled and pulled to the side of the road, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter than before. The world outside seemed too quiet now, the bright police lights reflecting in her mirrors. She knew how these situations could go. She had read the stories. She had even treated people in the hospital who had been in similar encounters. Some had walked away unharmed. Others had not been so lucky. She rolled down her window as two officers stepped out of their car. One was older, his expression unreadable, his uniform neatly pressed. The other was younger, his stance tense, his eyes watchful. They approached her car, and she kept both hands on the wheel, making sure they could see them clearly. "License and registration," the older officer said firmly, his voice carrying authority. Monique nodded, keeping her movements slow and careful. "Of course, officer," she said, reaching into her bag to retrieve her wallet. The younger officer shifted slightly, watching her every move. She handed over her license and reached into her glove compartment for the registration. She noticed the way the older officer's eyes lingered on her face, as if studying her. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Work," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "And where do you work?" "I'm a surgeon. I just finished my shift at the hospital." There was a slight pause, as if neither officer expected that answer. The older one glanced at her license, then back at her. "A surgeon, huh?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." The younger officer looked doubtful. He exchanged a glance with his partner before stepping back slightly. "Do you know why we pulled you over?" Monique frowned. "No, I don't." The older officer sighed. "Your car matches the description of a vehicle reported stolen in this area." For a moment, she didn't respond. She knew this car was hers. She had the registration to prove it. But she also knew that arguing wouldn't help. "Officer, this is my car. I have all the necessary documents right here." She kept her voice calm and respectful. The officer studied her for a moment, then took her registration and walked back to the police car, likely to run a check. Monique remained still, hands on the wheel, eyes staring straight ahead. The younger officer stayed beside her car, watching her closely. She could feel the weight of his suspicion, and it made her stomach tighten. Minutes passed, stretching longer than they should have. The cold night air drifted through her open window, but she barely felt it. She just wanted to go home. Finally, the older officer returned. He looked at her again, this time with a different expression, something close to hesitation. "Everything checks out," he said. "You're free to go." Monique exhaled slowly. No apology, no explanation, just that simple dismissal. She took her registration back and nodded. "Thank you, officer." Neither of them responded as they turned and walked back to their patrol car. Monique rolled up her window and took a moment to steady herself before pulling back onto the road. Her heart was still beating faster than usual, but she kept her focus on getting home. As she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how many lives she saved, no matter how much she worked, she would always have to prove herself again and again. But she didn't let it break her. Monique continued driving, her fingers still gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. The encounter with the police had left her tense, but she forced herself to take slow, steady breaths. She was almost home. That was all that mattered now. The streets were quiet, the glow of streetlights stretching across the pavement in long golden lines. She should have been thinking about resting, about finally getting a break after her exhausting shift, but her mind kept replaying the stop. The way the officers had looked at her, the suspicion in their eyes, the hesitation, even after checking her credentials. She had been through years of medical school, long nights of studying, endless hours in the hospital, proving herself again and again in a field where there was no room for mistakes. And yet, all of that had meant nothing in those few minutes on the side of the road. To those officers, she had been nothing more than a stranger to be questioned, doubted. Monique shook her head, pushing the thoughts aside. This wasn't the first time she had felt this way, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But she had chosen her path for a reason. Her job wasn't just about medicine. It was about making a difference, and she wasn't going to let anything take that away from her. She turned onto her street, pulling into the driveway of her small but comfortable home. The moment she stepped inside, she let out a long breath. The familiar scent of lavender from the diffuser in her living room greeted her. Home. A place where she didn't have to explain herself. After a quick shower, she changed into comfortable clothes and settled onto the couch with a cup of tea. Her muscles ached, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion. But just as she was about to close her eyes, her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A call. She reached for it, recognizing the hospital's number immediately. Her stomach clenched. Calls this late were rarely good news. "Dr. Carter speaking," she answered, sitting up straighter. "Dr. Carter, we have a trauma case coming in," the nurse on the other end said, her voice urgent but controlled. "Gunshot wound. Male. Late 40s. It's serious. We need you here now." Monique didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." The exhaustion in her bones disappeared in an instant, replaced by the sharp focus that always took over in moments like this. She set down her cup, grabbed her keys, and was back in her car within minutes. The drive to the hospital felt different from the one she had taken just an hour ago. This time, she wasn't heading home. She was racing toward a life that needed saving. As she pulled into the hospital parking lot, she spotted the flashing lights of an ambulance at the emergency entrance. Without wasting a second, she hurried inside, her mind already running through possible treatments. The ER was a rush of movement, nurses prepping, machines beeping, voices calling out vitals. She stepped into the trauma room, ready to take charge. And then she saw him. The patient on the gurney, unconscious, covered in blood, was Officer Bradley, the same officer who had pulled her over not long ago. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The last time she had seen this man, he had been standing outside her car, questioning her, doubting her words. Now he was lying helpless before her, his life hanging by a thread. But Monique didn't let the moment distract her. She was a doctor first, and this was just another patient who needed her help. She quickly assessed his condition. The gunshot wound was bad. The bullet had entered his abdomen, causing significant internal damage. His pulse was weak, his breathing shallow. "Get him to the OR now," she ordered, already snapping on a pair of gloves. The team moved fast, wheeling him toward surgery. Monique walked beside the gurney, her mind sharp, her emotions locked away. This wasn't about what had happened earlier that night. This wasn't about proving anything. This was about saving a life. And that was exactly what she intended to do. The doors of the operating room swung open as the team rushed in, wheeling Officer Bradley onto the table. The beeping of monitors filled the air. each sound a reminder of how little time they had. Every second counted. Dr. Monique Carter stepped forward, her hand steady, her mind sharp. The man lying on the table was the same officer who had pulled her over just hours ago, the one who had doubted her when she told him she was a doctor. But none of that mattered now. Right here, in this room, he wasn't an officer. He wasn't someone who had questioned her. He was just a patient. And she was the only one who could save him. "Vitals?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "Blood pressure is dropping -80/50. One of the nurses called out. "He's losing too much blood," another added. Monique nodded, already thinking ahead. "We need to get the bullet out fast. Prep for surgery. Let's move." The team sprang into action. The anesthesiologist ensured Bradley was stable enough for the procedure, while the nurses prepared the instruments. Monique scrubbed in quickly, slipping into her sterile gown and gloves. She took a deep breath. This was what she was trained for. This was what she had spent years perfecting. There was no room for hesitation. She stepped to the table, the bright surgical lights shining down, and made the first incision. The wound was deep. The bullet had torn through muscle and tissue, and if it had hit a major artery, things could turn bad very quickly. She worked fast, but carefully, her hands precise as she navigated through the damage. "Clamp," she said, extending her hand. A nurse placed the instrument in her palm without hesitation. The entire team worked like a well-oiled machine, responding to her every command. Minutes passed, each one feeling longer than the last. Sweat beaded on Monique's forehead, but she didn't let it distract her. She had to find the bullet before it caused more damage. Finally, she saw it, lodged near the liver, dangerously close to a major blood vessel. If she wasn't careful, removing it could cause even more bleeding. "Okay, I see it," she said, her voice steady. "Suction. We need a clear view." One of the assistants quickly followed her order. With the area clear, Monique carefully maneuvered her tools, inching the bullet out millimeter by millimeter. One wrong move, and the situation could spiral out of control. Her heartbeat remained steady. This was no different from the dozens of other trauma cases she had handled before. Except this time, she couldn't ignore the irony. The same man who had doubted her was now relying on her to keep him alive. She pushed the thought aside. Focus. That was all that mattered. After what felt like an eternity, she finally pulled the bullet free. The small piece of metal sat in her forceps, glistening under the bright lights. "Got it," she announced. A sigh of relief rippled through the room, but Monique wasn't done yet. "We need to stop the bleeding," she said. "Clamp here. More sutures." The next few minutes were critical. She worked quickly, repairing the damaged tissue, making sure the wound was closed properly. Every stitch was precise, every decision made with care. Slowly, Bradley's vitals began to stabilize. "Blood pressure is coming back up," a nurse reported. "He's holding steady." Monique gave a small nod. "Good. Let's finish up and get him to recovery." By the time the last stitch was in place, her hands ached from the long, intense procedure. But she didn't care. What mattered was that she had done her job. She stepped back, taking a deep breath. The weight of the moment settled over her, but she refused to let it distract her. She looked at the man on the table, his face pale, his body still, but alive. Hours ago, he had doubted her. Now, he owed his life to her. But she didn't do it for that. She did it because it was the right thing to do. And that was the only reason she ever needed. The surgery was over, but Dr. Monique Carter didn't allow herself to relax just yet. Officer Bradley had survived the operation, but his condition was still critical. The next 24 hours would determine everything. She pulled off her gloves, tossing them into the disposal bin, and removed her surgical mask. A deep breath filled her lungs, but the tension in her body remained. She stepped away from the operating table and glanced at the heart monitor. The rhythmic beeping confirmed what she already knew. He was alive. For now. The nurses and surgical assistants worked around her, cleaning up the tools and preparing to move Bradley to the intensive care unit. Monique stepped aside, watching as they carefully transferred him onto a hospital bed. His face was pale, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. Machines kept him stable, but his body had been through a lot. Monique checked the time. Nearly 3 in the morning. It was hard to believe that only a few hours ago she had been driving home, eager for rest. Now here she was, standing over a man who had stopped her on the road, questioning whether she even belonged behind the wheel of a car like hers. She hadn't thought about it during the surgery. There had been no time for personal feelings. But now, as she looked at him, unconscious and helpless, the irony of the situation was impossible to ignore. The same man who had doubted her had unknowingly put his life in her hands. But she had done her job. She had saved him, because that was what she did. "Dr. Carter," a nurse said softly, pulling her from her thoughts. "The IQ is ready for him." Monique nodded. "Let's move him." Together, they wheeled Bradley down the quiet hospital halls. The night shift staff worked with quiet efficiency, speaking in hushed voices as they passed. The hospital never truly slept. There was always another patient, another emergency, another life hanging in the balance. When they reached the ICU, Monique oversaw the final steps of the transfer. The nurses adjusted his IV lines, set up the monitors, and made sure everything was in place. His vitals remained stable, but she knew how quickly things could change. She made a few notes on his chart and turned to the head nurse. "Page me immediately if there's any change." "Of course, doctor," the nurse replied. Monique lingered for a moment longer, watching the steady rise and fall of Bradley's chest. He was still deep under sedation, unaware of the battle his body had just fought and won. With a final glance at the machines keeping him alive, she turned and walked out of the ICU. Her shift was over. She could go home now. But she didn't. Instead, she made her way to the hospital lounge, pouring herself a cup of lukewarm coffee. She didn't drink it, just held it in her hands, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. Her mind replayed everything: getting stopped, the questions, the way the officers had looked at her. And then, just hours later, being the only person who could save Bradley's life. She wondered if he would even remember her when he woke up. Would he realize who had stood over him in that operating room? Would it change anything? Monique wasn't sure. She had met people like him before, people who made judgments before they knew the full story. Some of them changed after experiencing a moment like this. Others didn't. She had done her part. The rest was up to him. After a long moment, she finally set the untouched coffee down and let out a slow breath. It was time to go home. She grabbed her coat, stepped out into the early morning air, and drove away, leaving the hospital behind for now. But she knew she'd be back soon. And she knew the real moment of truth would come when Officer Bradley finally opened his eyes. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The morning light filtered in through the blinds, casting soft shadows on the walls. Officer Bradley lay still, his body weak from surgery, but his heart was beating. He was alive. Monique had returned to the hospital early, even though she wasn't scheduled to start her next shift for a few more hours. She didn't know why she felt the need to check on him, but something told her she needed to be here. She stood just outside the doorway, looking in. A nurse was at his bedside, checking his vitals and making notes on his chart. The machines hummed softly, their numbers stable for now. Then, a small movement caught Monique's attention. Bradley's fingers twitched. A moment later, his eyelids fluttered. His breathing deepened as his body slowly pulled itself back to consciousness. The nurse noticed too. "Officer Bradley," she said gently. A low groan came from his throat, his head shifting slightly on the pillow. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, blinking against the light. He looked around, confused, trying to make sense of where he was. "You're in the hospital," the nurse explained. "You were shot, but you made it through surgery." Bradley swallowed hard, his throat dry. He blinked again, as if trying to clear his thoughts. His gaze drifted across the room, then stopped. Stopped on Monique. For a moment, there was only silence. His expression remained blank, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. His brows furrowed slightly, as if he was trying to piece something together. Monique stepped forward, her voice calm but professional. "Good morning, Officer Bradley. I'm Dr. Carter. I performed your surgery last night." His lips parted slightly as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. His gaze stayed locked on her, a mixture of confusion and something else, something unspoken. "You were in critical condition," she continued. "The bullet caused significant internal damage, but we were able to remove it and stop the bleeding. You're stable now, but you'll need time to recover." Bradley swallowed again, his Adam's apple moving slowly. He still hadn't spoken, but his expression was changing. His breathing had become slightly heavier, his eyes wider. It was clear now, he remembered. He remembered stopping her on the road. He remembered questioning her, doubting her. And now he was realizing that the same woman he had treated with suspicion was the one who had saved his life. The silence stretched between them. The nurse glanced between them, sensing the tension but saying nothing. Finally, Bradley's lips parted again, and this time his voice came out, low, rough, strained. "You." His voice was barely above a whisper. Monique raised an eyebrow slightly. "Yes. You're the doctor." His words were slow, like he was still trying to process them. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm the doctor." His face tightened, and he exhaled slowly. His fingers gripped the edge of the hospital blanket, his mind working through everything. Monique didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The realization was already sinking in. The man who had doubted her qualifications, who had treated her with suspicion just hours before his injury, had survived because of her skills. His eyes dropped slightly as if he couldn't meet her gaze for too long. A long breath escaped his lips. Finally, he spoke again. I didn't know." Monique tilted her head slightly. "Didn't know what?" His jaw tensed. "That you were a doctor." Monique gave a small nod. "I told you." Bradley let out another slow breath, his gaze still a mix of emotions. Shame, regret, something close to both. He wasn't an arrogant man. She could see that now. But he was a man who had judged too quickly, who had made an assumption without realizing the consequences. And now, that assumption was staring him in the face. The silence stretched again before he finally whispered, "Thank you." Monique held his gaze for a moment before nodding once. "You're welcome." There was nothing else to say. She turned to the nurse. "Keep monitoring his vitals. I'll check back later." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Bradley alone with his thoughts. As she stepped into the hallway, she let out a slow breath. She didn't need an apology. She didn't need him to explain himself. She had done her job. That was enough. And now, it was up to him to decide what he would do with the lesson he had just learned. The hospital was quiet in the early morning hours, the soft hum of machines and the occasional footsteps of nurses filling the air. Officer Bradley lay in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind heavy with thoughts. His body ached, but that wasn't what troubled him the most. It was the realization of what had happened. He had nearly died, and the person who saved him was the same woman he had doubted just hours before. His mind kept replaying the moment when Dr. Monique Carter walked into his room. The look on her face, calm, professional, unreadable, had made him feel something unfamiliar. Not just gratitude, but something deeper. A discomfort, an awareness of his own mistake. He had misjudged her. He had assumed things about her without knowing the truth. And now he owed her his life. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned his head slightly as a familiar figure stepped inside. "Bradley," said Sergeant Davis, his commanding officer, as he walked toward the bed. "How are you feeling?" Bradley swallowed, his throat still dry. "Been better," he said, his voice hoarse. Davis gave a small nod. "Yeah, I bet. We were all worried about you." Bradley exhaled slowly. What happened after I went down?" Davis pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. "The suspect was caught. Backup arrived a few minutes after you were hit. The guy didn't get far." Bradley nodded, his mind still hazy from the painkillers. "And my partner?" "Smith's fine. A few bruises, but nothing serious. He rode with you in the ambulance, but he had to go back on duty. He'll stop by later." There was a pause. Davis studied him for a moment before speaking again. "The doctors said it was close. You lost a lot of blood." Bradley shifted slightly in the bed, feeling the bandages tight around his abdomen. "Yeah," he muttered. "I know." Davis hesitated, then leaned forward. "They also said your surgeon was incredible. That she saved your life when things could have gone bad real fast." Bradley didn't respond right away. His jaw clenched slightly. Davis raised an eyebrow. "She's the same doctor you pulled over, isn't she?" Bradley exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Yeah." Davis let out a low whistle. "Well, that's something." Bradley turned his head away, staring at the wall. He didn't need to be reminded. He had already thought about it 100 times since waking up. "I judged her," he admitted quietly. "I assumed things about her." Davis didn't say anything right away. He let the words sit there between them. Finally, he spoke. "We all make mistakes, Bradley. What matters is what you do after." Bradley sighed. "Yeah." Another silence stretched between them before Davis stood up. "Rest up. You'll have plenty of time to think about things later." He gave Bradley a nod before heading toward the door. But before he left, he paused. "You should talk to her," he said. "Not just to say thanks, but because you need to." Bradley didn't reply. Davis left, the door clicking softly behind him. Bradley stared at the ceiling again. He knew Davis was right. He needed to talk to her, not just because she saved him, but because he needed to admit that he had been wrong. And that wasn't something he had ever found easy to do. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the hospital window, casting a warm glow on the white walls. Officer Bradley lay in his bed, still weak but more alert than before. His mind had been restless since waking up, thoughts circling in his head like a storm that wouldn't settle. He knew what he had to do. There was only one person he needed to talk to. The door creaked open, and his heart rate picked up slightly when he saw Dr. Monique Carter step inside. She wore her white coat over her scrubs, a stethoscope draped around her neck. Her expression was calm, unreadable, the same as when she had first walked into his room earlier that morning. She checked the clipboard at the foot of his bed before looking at him. "How are you feeling?" Bradley cleared his throat. "Better," he said, his voice still a little rough. "Good. Your vitals are stable, and there's no sign of infection. If everything continues this way, you should be able to leave in a few days." Bradley nodded, unsure of what to say next. There was an awkward silence between them, heavy and unspoken. Monique moved to adjust one of the monitors, her focus on the screen. "Do you have any pain?" "Nothing I can't handle," he replied. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "Listen, doctor." She turned to face him, waiting. He hesitated. The words felt heavier than he expected. He had given orders his whole career, spoken with authority in every situation. But this was different. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. Monique didn't react right away. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Bradley swallowed, forcing himself to continue. "That night, when I pulled you over, I made assumptions. I judged you before I knew anything about you." He exhaled. "I was wrong." Monique studied him for a moment before speaking. "Yes, you were." Bradley flinched slightly at the directness of her words, but he didn't argue. He had no right to. Another silence stretched between them before she finally sighed. Do you know how many times that's happened to me? Bradley shook his head. Too many, she said. I've worked my entire life to get here. I've spent years proving myself. But even now, I still run into people who assume I don't belong. She crossed her arms, her voice steady but firm. And the worst part is that I don't get the luxury of being angry about it. I don't get to let it affect my job. Because if I did, people would say I'm unprofessional, emotional, too sensitive. Bradley felt a lump form in his throat. He had never thought about it like that before. You're lucky, she continued, because your mistakes don't usually cost you anything. But mine, they do. If I had let my frustration affect me that night, if I had let my feelings interfere with my job, you wouldn't be here right now. Bradley swallowed hard. I know, he admitted, and I'm grateful. Monique's expression softened slightly. I don't need your gratitude, officer. I just need you to understand. I do, he said, and for the first time, he truly meant it. Monique nodded. Good. She turned to check his IV line, making a few adjustments. The silence between them wasn't as heavy anymore. It was different now. After a moment, Bradley spoke again. You saved my life. I did. He let out a slow breath. And I'll never forget that. Monique glanced at him, then gave a small nod. I hope not. With that, she stepped back. I have other patients to check on. Get some rest, Officer Bradley. Bradley watched as she walked to the door, her posture straight, her step steady. Dr. Carter, he called just before she left. She turned slightly, waiting. I'm sorry, he said, the words quiet but firm. For everything. Monique held his gaze for a moment before giving a small nod. Take care, officer. Then she was gone. Bradley exhaled, sinking deeper into his bed. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally seeing things clearly. And that, he realized, was just as important as surviving. The hospital room was quiet again, except for the steady beeping of the monitors. Officer Bradley lay still, his mind replaying everything that had happened. The night of the traffic stop, the moment he was shot, waking up in the hospital to find out that the very person he had doubted, Dr. Monique Carter, was the one who had saved him. And now, after their conversation, he felt something unfamiliar, a deep, humbling realization. For years, he had thought of himself as a good officer. Fair, just, professional. But now, looking back, he saw the small moments, the times he had let his own assumptions cloud his judgment. He had never thought of himself as someone who judged others unfairly. But the truth was, he had done just that. And this time, it had almost cost him his life. There was a soft knock on the door. He turned his head and saw his partner, Officer Smith, stepping inside. Hey, man, Smith said with a grin. You're looking better. Bradley smirked slightly. Still feel like I got hit by a truck. Yeah, well, you kinda did, Smith said, pulling up a chair. How's the pain? Bradley shrugged. Manageable. There was a pause before Smith's expression turned serious. Man, you scared us out there. I thought we were gonna lose you. Bradley exhaled. Yeah, me too. Smith leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I heard about what happened. With the doctor. Bradley looked at him, waiting. Smith nodded. She's the one you pulled over, right? Yeah, Bradley admitted. Crazy how life works, Smith said. You stop her 1 minute, and the next, she's saving you. Bradley let out a slow breath. Yeah, crazy. Smith studied him for a moment. You talked to her? Bradley nodded. Yeah, I told her I was wrong. Smith raised an eyebrow. And, Bradley sighed, she already knew. Smith chuckled. Yeah, I bet she did. There was a long silence. Finally, Smith spoke again. So, what now? Bradley knew what he meant. What would he do with everything he had learned? Would he just move on, pretending this was just another incident? Or would he let it change him? He looked at Smith and answered, "Now, I do better." Smith nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind those words. Bradley knew he couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo his mistakes, but he could make sure he never made the same mistake again. A few days later, he was released from the hospital. The department had arranged for a temporary desk job while he recovered. He spent hours filling out reports, catching up on paperwork, and thinking about how he had spent years enforcing the law but never questioned his own biases. Thinking about how easy it had been to judge someone based on assumptions instead of facts. And thinking about Dr. Monique Carter, the woman who had every reason to walk away, but chose instead to save his life. One evening, a few weeks later, he found himself standing outside the hospital again. He wasn't sure what had brought him there, but he knew he needed to do something more than just say sorry. He walked inside, past the busy hallways filled with nurses, doctors, and patients. After asking at the front desk, he was directed to a small break room where Monique was sitting, sipping coffee during a rare quiet moment. She looked up as he entered, surprised but calm. "Officer Bradley," she said, "didn't expect to see you here." Bradley hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. "I know you're busy, so I won't take much of your time," he said, "but I wanted to thank you again. And not just for saving my life." Monique raised an eyebrow. "Oh," Bradley exhaled, "for opening my eyes." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "Well," she said, taking another sip of her coffee, "I hope you keep them open." "I will," he promised, and for the first time, he truly meant it. He walked out of the hospital that night feeling lighter. He knew this wasn't about fixing just one mistake. It was about changing how he saw the world, how he treated people, how he carried out his duty as an officer. And for the first time in his career, he understood what it really meant to serve and protect.